Okay, so just digging into the last episode of Alien Earth, which just a great season and brilliant writing on the show. And there was a line in this episode that really stood out to me that really kind of reframed one of the major characters. We'll talk about Boy Kavalier and his arc. And this is the line that Wendy delivers to him in just chilling fashion. And she says, "You are not Peter Pan. He was a boy who never grew up, but you were never a boy. You've always been a man, a mean, angry little man who decided to hate everyone." A shocking line, delivered just like in classic style for her, but the way he absorbs it, he really understands. Like, this instantly reframes everything about the character and about how he has projected himself to the entire world as this fairy tale story of a boy who never grew up. He's Peter Pan, but he's actually a dark portrait of a childhood that got stolen and it got replaced by an adult posture. And that's significant to who he is, and that defines him far more detailed than anything else. That's actually hitting the mark, because what it does is it compresses this trauma and this intellect into one single accusation. He did not fail to grow up. That's not what happened. He did not have a child wonder view of the world and still retain that. He was forced to become a man too early. That's the replacement. From the time of being a child, he saw the world as a man would see it because of his intellect. He never in his entire existence saw the world from a child's eye. So he was never a child who did not grow up into being a man. He was always a man, as she says it, in a child, in a man's body. You were just in a child's body. You were just mean. You were angry because of your circumstance. You were denied having what is normal for most humans, is that childhood, how important that is psychologically. So this really changes his story from this aspiration of genius. He's here, he has the power, but there's this cost, this incredible cost that no one had factored, not even him. He didn't have the intelligence to even understand this. And it's his stunted emotions, it's his rage, it's his moral blindness, which he is. It's all about that. He'll just still do anything. He has no guardrails, and his choices are built around anger, around control, around actual contempt. So this is the compensation for that lost development. It's not just villainy. It's 100% arrested development. He is intelligence, but lacked any maturation that affects regulation. And he reveals himself when he talks about his first synth that he builds that kills his father, because he understands that as a 6-year-old at the time, he can't run a company. So he needs to replace his father just to fulfill that end. So we start to see how you saw the world at 6 years old. Now, we've seen 6-year-old be intelligent, 6-year-old genius, but not to this degree where it has become a curse. You never get to enjoy the simplicity of being a child. Think about your childhood and how important those years were for you, and how fond most of us think about most of the parts of our childhood, like playing games and learning, just not having responsibilities or even having the thought of it, worries in your head. He never got that, and that shaped who he was. And while he's been running around trying to emulate what he wanted to be, which is Peter Pan, what he actually is something like far darker, far more tragic. And I think the show does a brilliant job of bringing that out. So I wanted to talk about just some absolutely brilliant writing that's on the show, something I think is going to bode well for the next season. Give me your thoughts in the comment section. As always, ask you hit that like and subscribe.